I knew my daughter-in-law had crossed a line she should never have crossed, and I still signed the divorce papers without saying a word. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee, the kind of place where lives quietly fell apart behind closed doors. Richard sat across from me, his posture stiff, his eyes avoiding mine the way they had for months now. Beside him, Emily adjusted the sleeve of her cream blazer, her expression composed, almost serene, as if this were just another appointment on her calendar. If anyone had walked in at that moment, they might have thought she was the one married to him. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and let the silence stretch just a second longer than comfortable. It was a small thing, but I had learned over the years that silence could reveal more than any question ever could. "Margaret, we've reviewed the terms," the attorney said, sliding a neat stack of papers toward me. "This agreement ensures a clean and efficient separation." Clean. Efficient. Words designed to make something painful sound reasonable. I nodded slowly, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the document, but I didn't pick it up yet. Instead, I glanced at Richard. 38 years of marriage, and in that moment he looked like a stranger I had once passed in a grocery store aisle. Polite. Distant. Forgettable. Emily leaned forward slightly, just enough to be noticed. "It's really the best option for everyone," she said, her voice soft, practiced, careful. I recognized that tone. I had heard it before at family dinners, when she would suggest changes that somehow always worked in her favor. I turned my head just enough to meet her eyes. She smiled. It was a perfect smile. Too perfect. The kind that never quite reached the eyes. I held her gaze for a second longer than she expected, and something flickered there, just for a moment before she looked away. That was when I knew I had been right. Not because of what I had seen 2 nights earlier, or the message that had appeared on a screen that wasn't meant for me, or the way Richard had suddenly started guarding his phone like it held state secrets. No. I knew because of that flicker. People can hide many things, but they can't always hide the moment they realize you might already know. I finally picked up the papers. The pages were crisp, the ink still sharp and new. My name was printed neatly at the bottom of the last page, waiting for my signature like it had been there all along. Like this ending had been decided long before I walked into that room. "Take your time," the attorney said, but his tone suggested the opposite. I skimmed the lines, not really reading, because I already understood what they thought they were taking from me. The house. The accounts. The life I had spent decades building piece by piece. I could feel their attention on me, quiet but heavy. Waiting. Watching. Expecting hesitation. Expecting emotion. I gave them neither. Instead, I reached for the pen. It felt heavier than it should have, cool against my fingers. For just a second I paused, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to remember this moment exactly as it was. The look on Richard's face. The stillness in Emily's posture. The quiet confidence they both carried, believing they had already won. Then I signed my name. Smooth. Steady. No trembling. No second thoughts. I placed the pen down gently and slid the papers back across the table. Emily exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, and Richard nodded as if something had finally been settled. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself the smallest smile. Not the kind that needed to be seen. Just enough to remind myself that sometimes, the most powerful move you can make is the one no one else understands yet. The house felt different the moment I walked back in. As if it already knew something had ended even before the ink on those papers had time to dry. I set my purse down on the entry table with the same care I had used for years, placing it in the exact spot where it always rested, but the familiarity no longer comforted me. The air was too still, too quiet, like a place that had already been emptied of something important. I slipped off my shoes and stood there for a moment, listening. No television humming in the background. No footsteps upstairs. Just silence. It had been building for months, that silence growing slowly between rooms, between conversations, between the 2 people who were supposed to share this space with me. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the light even though it was still early afternoon. The brightness made everything look sharper, almost staged. The coffee maker sat clean and unused. Richard had stopped making coffee at home weeks ago, claiming he preferred the one near his office. At the time I had nodded and said nothing. Now I understood that habits do not just change overnight. They shift for a reason. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the neatly arranged shelves, Not because I was hungry, but because I needed something ordinary to hold on to. Carton of milk. A container of leftovers I had made 2 nights ago. He had not touched them. Instead, there had been a receipt on the counter that morning, folded once, carelessly left behind. A restaurant I did not recognize. 2 meals. 1 dessert. I had not asked about it. I had simply placed it in the drawer with the others, the small pieces of evidence that had begun to form a quiet pattern I could no longer ignore. I closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter, letting my eyes drift across the room. This kitchen had seen everything. Birthday cakes with uneven frosting when Daniel was young. Holiday dinners where every chair was filled and every voice overlapped with laughter. Even the quiet evenings when it was just Richard and me, sitting across from each other with nothing urgent to say but no need to fill the space. Somewhere along the way that had changed. Not all at once. Not in a way that demanded attention. Just small shifts. Missed conversations. Shorter answers. Longer silences. And then Emily. She had entered our lives with a kind of brightness that felt almost too polished to be real. I remembered the first time she stood in this kitchen, complimenting the cabinets, the countertops, the way everything looked so well kept. She had smiled at me then, warm and attentive, asking questions that made it seem like she genuinely wanted to know me. I had believed her. I had wanted to believe her. Over time, her visits became more frequent, even when Daniel was not with her. First, I thought it was kindness. Then I thought it was coincidence. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain it. I walked toward the hallway and paused by the small table near the stairs, where Richard used to leave his keys. They were not there. He had started carrying them upstairs, keeping them close, as if something as simple as a set of keys needed protection. I reached out and ran my fingers along the surface of the table, tracing the faint scratches left behind from years of use. There was a time when everything in this house felt shared. Now it felt divided, even before anything had been formally separated. I moved upstairs slowly, my hand resting lightly on the banister. Each step felt heavier than it should have, not because I was tired, but because I knew what I would find. The bedroom door was slightly open. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The bed was made, too neatly, the way it always was when something had been carefully hidden beneath the surface. I walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer. His cologne was still there, but the scent that lingered in the room was not the one I recognized. It was something lighter, unfamiliar, almost floral. I closed the drawer without reacting and crossed to the nightstand. His phone charger was plugged in, but the cable was missing. Another small detail. Another piece of a larger picture. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that had once held decades of shared history. Photographs still lined the walls. Smiles captured in frames that no longer matched the reality of what stood in front of me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening the message I had seen 2 nights earlier. It had appeared for only a second, just long enough for me to read a name that should not have been there, followed by a line that was too familiar to be mistaken for anything innocent. I did not read it again. I did not need to. Instead, I locked the screen and set the phone beside me. I exhaled slowly and let the quiet settle around me. There was a time when I would have asked questions. When I would have demanded explanations, searched for reasons, tried to fix something that had already begun to break. But sitting there now, in a room that no longer felt like mine, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. The truth does not always need to be spoken out loud to be real. Sometimes it is enough to see it clearly and decide what to do next. And I had already made that decision before I ever walked into that conference room. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a thin line of pale light slipping through the curtains and stretching quietly across the bedroom floor. I had not slept much, but I did not feel tired. There was a strange clarity in my thoughts, the kind that comes when something unsettled finally settles into place. I got out of bed slowly, smoothing the fabric of the blanket behind me as if routine still mattered. Did, in a way. Routine kept everything looking normal. And for now, normal was exactly what I needed. I walked downstairs and started the coffee maker, measuring each scoop with the same precision I had used for years. The machine hummed softly, filling the kitchen with a familiar sound that once signaled the beginning of a shared morning. Today, it only marked the passing of time. I poured myself a cup and sat at the table, wrapping both hands around the warmth of the mug. Outside, a car passed, its tires brushing lightly against the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Life continued, indifferent to what had shifted inside this house. I took a slow sip and reached for the folder I had placed on the table the night before. It looked ordinary, plain, unremarkable. Inside it, however, were copies of documents I had not looked at in years. Property deeds, account statements, legal papers that Richard had always insisted on handling himself. At the time I had trusted him, not blindly but comfortably. Now that comfort felt like something I had outgrown. I opened the folder and began turning each page carefully, not rushing, not skipping. Every detail mattered. Every number, every signature, every date. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet process of rediscovery. I was not searching for something specific. I was learning what was already mine. Halfway through, I paused at a document I did not fully remember signing. My name was there, neat and deliberate, but the context around it felt distant, like a conversation I had once had but never truly understood. I set the page aside and made a small note in the margin of a notepad beside me. Not a question, just a mark. Something to return to. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second moving forward without hesitation. I appreciated that about time. It did not look back. It did not explain itself. It simply moved. I closed the folder after a while and leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze drift across the kitchen again. Everything was in its place. Nothing looked broken, and yet nothing felt the same. My phone buzzed lightly against the table, pulling me back to the present. I glanced at the screen. A message from Richard. Short, direct. He would be stopping by later to pick up a few things. No apology. No explanation. Just a statement of intent. As if this house had already become a place he visited rather than lived in. I read the message once, then set the phone down without responding. There was no need. Some conversations no longer required words. A few minutes later, another message appeared. This one from Emily. She wrote with a careful politeness that almost felt rehearsed, asking if it would be all right for her to come along, saying she wanted to make sure everything went smoothly. I let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Smoothly. That was an interesting choice of words. I picked up the phone, typed a single response, and sent it before I could overthink it. Of course. The house is open. I placed the phone face down and finished my coffee in silence. If they expected resistance, they would not find it. If they expected confrontation, they would be disappointed. Because what they did not understand was that I had already moved past the point where either of those things mattered. By the time the sun had risen fully, casting a stronger light across the kitchen, I was already on my way out the door. I locked it behind me, slipping the key into my bag with a quiet, deliberate motion. The drive across town took about 20 minutes, familiar streets unfolding in a sequence I had followed countless times before. But today, I was not going to the grocery store or meeting a friend for lunch. Today, I turned into a parking lot I had not visited in years. The building stood tall and understated, its glass doors reflecting the morning sky. I parked the car, sat for a moment, and looked at my reflection. In the rearview mirror, there were lines on my face that had not been there before. A tiredness around my eyes that spoke of long nights and quiet realizations. But there was something else too. Something steadier. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, each step measured, unhurried. Inside, the air was cool, the reception area quiet except for the soft clicking of a keyboard somewhere behind the desk. The woman at the front looked up and smiled politely. I returned the smile, just enough to acknowledge her, and then gave her my name. She checked something on her screen and nodded, gesturing toward a hallway. He is expecting you. Of course he was. I had called late the night before, after everything had settled into place in my mind. Not to ask for help. Not exactly. More to confirm something I had begun to suspect. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muted against the carpet, until I reached the door at the end. I paused there for just a second, my hand resting lightly against the handle. Then I opened it and stepped inside, ready to hear what I already knew would change everything. The office was quieter than I expected, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel deliberate. From the soft closing of the door behind me to the faint rustle of paper as the man at the desk looked up. He stood as I entered, offering a polite smile that carried a familiarity I had not seen in years. Thomas Reed had always been that way, composed, observant, the kind of attorney who listened more than he spoke. Richard used to trust him once, before everything shifted toward people who agreed more quickly and asked fewer questions. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm, steady. "It has been a while." I nodded as I took the seat across from him, placing my bag carefully on the floor beside my chair. "It has," I replied, my tone matching his. No emotion, no hesitation, just acknowledgement. He studied me for a brief moment, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that suggested he already understood more than I had said. "You mentioned on the phone that you wanted to review everything," he said, gesturing lightly to the folder in front of him. "All of it." I leaned back, slightly folding my hands together. "Yes," I said. "Everything." He opened the folder and began to lay out documents across the desk, each one placed with careful precision. The movement was methodical, almost surgical. "Your property is not structured the way most people assume," he began, his tone even. "A significant portion of your assets are held in a trust that was established years ago, not just for convenience but for protection." Protection. The word settled quietly in the space between us. I did not react outwardly, but I felt something shift internally, like a piece of a puzzle finally locking into place. Protection from what? I asked, though I already had an idea. He met my gaze directly. "From situations exactly like this." He slid one document closer to me, tapping lightly near a paragraph marked with a small tab. "The trust specifies that any marital dissolution involving misconduct or concealment of assets triggers a full review of ownership. It is not automatic, but it gives you the authority to challenge any agreement signed under incomplete or misleading conditions." I looked down at the page, reading each line slowly, deliberately. The language was precise, firm in a way that left little room for interpretation. My name appeared more than once, not as a secondary party, but as the primary holder of decision-making authority. I let my eyes move across the words again, not because I needed to understand them, but because I wanted to be certain I had not missed anything. "And if I have already signed something?" I asked. He did not hesitate. "Then we examine the circumstances under which you signed it. If there was any omission of material information, particularly regarding shared assets or relationships that could influence the agreement, there is ground to contest it." Relationships that could influence the agreement. He did not say the word, but it did not need to be spoken. I nodded once, slowly, absorbing the implication without reacting to it. "What about control?" I asked. "Access, accounts, decision-making." Thomas turned another page, revealing a series of statements and account summaries that felt both familiar and distant at the same time. "You have more control than you have been led to believe," he said. "Several accounts require dual authorization, but the trust allows you to revoke that requirement under specific conditions. Once that happens, access can be restricted." Immediately. Immediately. The word echoed quietly in my mind. Not next week. Not after a long process. Immediately. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk. "And those conditions?" He met my eyes again, his expression unchanged. "They are met if there is evidence that one party has acted in bad faith with regard to shared assets or fiduciary responsibility." I sat back again, letting the weight of that settle. Evidence. Not suspicion. Not assumption. Evidence. I thought of the message, the receipt, the subtle shifts that had accumulated over time, each one small on its own, but undeniable when viewed together. I had not confronted them. I had not needed to. "What would you need from me?" I asked. Thomas closed the folder halfway, his hands resting lightly on top of it. "Clarity," he said, "and patience. We do not act impulsively. We act precisely." I allowed myself the smallest nod. Precision. That was something I understood. "And timing?" I asked. He gave a faint, almost knowing smile. "Timing is everything." The room fell quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not empty. Not uncertain. Just still, like the moment before something begins. I reached out and touched the edge of the document closest to me, not to move it, but to ground myself in what I was seeing. For years I had allowed someone else to handle these details, to manage the structure of a life I believed was shared. Now, sitting across from a man who spoke in measured certainty, I realized that structure had never been as simple as I had assumed. It had layers, protections, conditions that had been put in place long before I ever needed them. I exhaled slowly, steady, controlled. "All right," I said. "Then we do this properly." Thomas nodded once, closing the folder completely this time. "We do," he replied. I stood, gathering my back, my movements calm and deliberate. Nothing about me needed to change on the surface. That was the point. As I walked toward the door, my reflection caught briefly in the glass panel beside it. For a moment I paused, looking at the woman staring back at me. She looked the same as she had that morning. Same posture, same expression, but there was something different in her eyes. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. And as I stepped out into the hallway, I understood something with absolute certainty. I had not walked into that room to ask for help. I had walked in to confirm that I still had control. And now that I knew I did, everything else would follow. I returned home just before noon, the sunlight sharper now, cutting through the windows in a way that made every surface look almost too clear, too exposed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it quietly behind me as if I were entering a place that required caution rather than comfort. The house had not changed in the few hours I had been gone, but I had. That was enough to make everything feel different. I set my bag down and walked straight to the kitchen, not out of habit this time but with purpose. The folder I had left on the table was still there, exactly where I had placed it. I pulled out the chair and sat down, opening it again, but now I was not simply reviewing. I was confirming. Each document I had glanced at earlier now carried weight. Each detail had direction. I reached for my notepad and began writing, not in long sentences, not in explanations, but in short, precise lines. Account names, dates, conditions, authority. The words looked almost clinical on the page, stripped of emotion, reduced to function. That was intentional. Emotion had no place in what came next. My phone buzzed again, but this time I did not check it immediately. Instead, I finished the line I was writing, placed the pen down carefully, and only then turned the screen over. Another message from Richard. He would be arriving in 30 minutes. Short, direct, predictable. I glanced at the clock on the wall. That gave me just enough time. I stood and walked upstairs, moving through each room with a quiet awareness I had not allowed myself before. The guest room, untouched. The hallway, still lined with photographs that told a story no longer accurate. And then the bedroom. I stepped inside and paused, letting my eyes move across the space one more time. Nothing had shifted physically, but now I could see everything for what it was, not what I had once believed it to be. I walked to the dresser and opened the drawer again, taking out a small box I had not touched in years. Inside were documents I had kept separate, not because I expected to need them, but because something in me had always preferred to have a copy. I held them for a moment, then placed them neatly into my bag. No hesitation, no second-guessing, just action. Downstairs, I moved through the living room, straightening a cushion, adjusting a frame slightly on the shelf. Small movements that made the space appear unchanged, controlled. I was not preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for an observation. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway reached me before I saw it. I did not rush. I did not react. I simply walked to the window and looked out. Richard stepped out first, his posture familiar, his movements efficient. Emily followed a second later, smoothing her coat, her expression composed in that same careful way I had seen before. They stood there for a moment, speaking quietly to each other, unaware that I was watching. It was a small moment, but it told me everything I needed to know. Alignment, comfort, no tension between them. That meant they believed the situation was settled. I stepped away from the window and moved to the door, opening it before they had a chance to knock. "You are early," I said, my voice even, almost welcoming. Richard looked slightly surprised, but he recovered quickly. "Traffic was light," he replied, stepping inside without waiting. Emily offered a polite smile as she followed him in. "Thank you for letting us come by," she said, her tone soft, measured. I nodded once and stepped aside, allowing them to enter fully. "Of course," I said. "Take what you need. No questions. No resistance. Exactly what they expected. Richard moved toward the stairs immediately, his focus already elsewhere. Emily lingered for a moment in the entryway, her eyes scanning the room with a subtle curiosity, as if she were measuring something invisible. I watched her without making it obvious, noting the way her gaze paused on certain details. The furniture, the layout, the space itself. Not sentimental. Evaluative. "You have a beautiful home," she said, almost absently. I met her eyes and gave a small, controlled smile. "Yes," I replied. "I do." She held my gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, then looked away, following Richard upstairs. I remained where I was, listening to the faint sounds of movement. Above me, drawers opening, footsteps crossing the floor. The quiet dismantling of something they assumed was already theirs. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up my coffee cup, now cold, and took a small sip anyway. It did not taste the same, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that everything was moving exactly as it needed to. No interruptions. No suspicion. Just progress. I set the cup down and glanced once more at the folder on the table, then at the notepad beside it. The plan was not complicated. Did not need to be. It only needed to be precise. And as I stood there, listening to the quiet sounds of their confidence unfolding upstairs, I realized something with absolute clarity. They were not being careful. They did not think they needed to be. And that was the one mistake I had been waiting for. I heard them before I saw them again. The soft thud of a drawer closing, the muted sound of footsteps descending the stairs, unhurried, confident, as if they were simply finishing a task they had every right to complete. I did not move from the kitchen. I did not need to. I stood by the counter, one hand resting lightly against the edge, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral. When they entered the room, Richard was carrying a small box, the kind people use when they are gathering what they consider essential. Emily followed just behind him, her movements smooth, composed, her eyes scanning the space again, but this time with less curiosity and more quiet satisfaction. "That should be everything for now," Richard said, setting the box down briefly on the table as if to adjust his grip. "For now." I noted the phrase but did not react to it. Instead, I nodded once, acknowledging without engaging. "Take your time," I said, my voice steady even. Emily glanced at me just for a moment, as if she were trying to read something beneath the surface, but there was nothing there for her to find. I had made sure of that. Richard picked the box back up, shifting its weight slightly. "We will come back later for the rest," he added, already turning toward the door. I watched him for a second, not as a wife, not even as someone who had shared a life with him, but as an observer. Detached. Focused. He moved through the space like someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. Emily lingered again, just a fraction longer than necessary, her fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair as she passed. It was a small gesture, but it carried a sense of ownership that did not belong to her. "You have always kept everything so organized," she said, her tone almost thoughtful. I met her eyes and allowed a faint, controlled smile to appear. "It makes things easier," I replied. She held my gaze for a second, then gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken, before following Richard out the door. I walked with them to the entryway, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to see the moment clearly. Richard stepped outside first, placing the box in the back seat of the car. Emily paused at the doorway, turning back toward me one last time. "We will be in touch," she said, her voice polite, measured. I inclined my head slightly. "Of course," I said. No resistance. No hesitation. Exactly what they expected. She gave a small smile and stepped outside, closing the distance between herself and Richard with a familiarity that no longer needed to be hidden. I closed the door gently behind them, the soft click of the latch echoing briefly in the quiet house. For a moment I stood there, my hand still resting on the handle, listening to the sound of the car engine starting, then fading as they pulled away. I did not move until the silence returned completely. Then I turned and walked back into the kitchen. The room looked the same as it had an hour ago, but something had shifted. Not in the furniture. Not in the light. In the balance. I picked up my phone and unlocked it, scrolling through a series of messages I had not yet responded to. One from Thomas. Short. Direct. "Ready when you are." I read it once, then set the phone down on the table beside the folder. Ready. That was an interesting word. It implied a beginning, not an ending. I reached for the notepad and reviewed the lines I had written earlier, each one precise, each one intentional. There were no questions left. Only steps. I stood and walked to the small cabinet near the corner of the kitchen, opening it to retrieve a set of keys I had not used in some time. They felt unfamiliar in my hand at first, heavier than I remembered, but that feeling passed quickly. I placed them in my bag alongside the documents I had collected earlier. Everything I needed was already in place. I moved through the house one more time, not to check, not to confirm, but to observe. The living room, the hallway, the bedroom upstairs. Each space held the same quiet stillness, but now it felt different. Not empty, not abandoned, just waiting. I paused at the top of the stairs and looked down, letting my eyes take in the entire space from a distance. For years I had seen this house as something shared, something built together. Now I saw it clearly for what it was. Structured, defined, protected. I walked back downstairs, my steps steady, unhurried, and returned to the kitchen. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, marking time without concern. I picked up my phone again and opened a new message. My fingers hovered over the screen for just a second, then began to type. Not long, not complicated. Just enough. I pressed send and set the phone down. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to shift, casting longer shadows across the yard. Inside, everything remained quiet, controlled, exactly as it needed to be. I walked to the window and looked out, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just observing. There was a certain clarity in this moment, a calm that did not come from ignorance, but from understanding. They believed they had already taken what mattered. They believed the outcome was already fixed. And because of that, they had stopped paying attention. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, and allowed myself the smallest, almost imperceptible breath. Not relief, not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. The pieces were in place. The timing was right. And for the first time since everything had begun to unravel, I was not reacting to what had been done. I was deciding what would happen next. The call came sooner than I expected, just as the afternoon light began to fade into that quiet gray that settles in before evening. My phone vibrated once against the table, and I picked it up without hesitation. It was Thomas. I did not let it ring a second time. It is done, he said, his voice as calm as ever. No build-up, no unnecessary detail, just the outcome. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I turned slightly, letting my gaze rest on the window, watching the reflection of the room rather than the world outside. All of it? I asked. All of it, he confirmed. The accounts have been restricted. Authorization protocols have been updated. Any attempt to access or transfer will now require your direct approval. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of relief but to mark the shift. There is a difference between planning and execution. Between knowing what can be done and knowing it has been done. And the review? I asked. Initiated, he said. We will have formal documentation prepared within 48 hours. Enough to establish a clear position if they attempt to contest anything. 48 hours. I let the number settle. Time once again moving forward without hesitation. Good, I said simply. There was a pause on the line, not uncomfortable, just measured. You handled this exactly right, Thomas added. No confrontation. No warning. That matters. I allowed myself the smallest breath, almost imperceptible. I understand, I replied. We ended the call without ceremony. No closing remarks. No reassurances. None were needed. I set the phone down and remained still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house around me. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same furniture. The same light, the same stillness, but beneath it, everything had shifted into place. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the simple act grounding me in the present. The glass was cool in my hand, the water clear, undisturbed. I took a slow sip and set it down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the counter. Precision. That word stayed with me, not just in action but in thought. My phone buzzed again, this time with a different tone. A notification. I glanced at the screen. A missed attempt. Then another. The names attached to the alerts were exactly the ones I expected. Richard. Then moments later, Emily. I did not open them immediately. Instead, I watched as another notification appeared. And another. Repetition without success. I could almost see it unfolding from a distance. The confusion first. A simple error perhaps. Then, the second attempt. Slight concern. Then the third. The realization that something was not responding the way it should. I picked up the phone and opened one of the messages. It was short. Direct. Richard asking if there was an issue with the accounts. No accusation yet. Just uncertainty. I read it once and set the phone back down without replying. A second message followed quickly. This one from Emily. More carefully worded. Suggesting there might be a system error. Asking if I had noticed anything unusual. I allowed a faint, almost invisible smile to pass across my face. Unusual. That was one way to describe it. I walked into the living room and sat down, folding my hands loosely in my lap, the phone resting beside me. I did not rush to respond. I did not feel the need to correct their assumptions. Let them wonder. Let them try again. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, marking each second with quiet consistency. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The messages grew slightly more urgent though still controlled. They were careful. They had to be. At least for now. I picked up the phone again and opened a new message, my fingers moving slowly, deliberately across the screen. I did not explain. I did not accuse. I did not reveal anything they had not already begun to suspect. I simply wrote a single sentence and sent it. We will discuss everything at the meeting. Nothing more. Nothing less. I placed the phone down and leaned back slightly, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged. Outside, the last of the daylight had begun to fade completely, leaving the room in a softer, dimmer light. Inside, everything remained exactly as it should be. Controlled. Measured. Final. For the first time since all of this had begun, there was no uncertainty left. No questions waiting to be answered. Only outcomes waiting to unfold. And as I sat there listening to the quiet, I understood something with complete clarity. They thought they had taken control by acting first. What they did not realize was that acting first only matters if you understand the rules. And they never did. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning at 10 o'clock, and I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was anxious, but because I preferred to control the pace of my own time. The building was the same one we had been in before, but the atmosphere felt different now, quieter, more deliberate, as if even the walls understood that something final was about to take place. I checked in at the front desk and was directed to the same conference room, the same polished table, the same chairs arranged with careful symmetry. I took my seat without hesitation, placing my bag beside me, my hands resting lightly on the surface of the table. There was no folder in front of me this time. I did not need one. Everything that mattered was already in motion. A few minutes later, the door opened and Richard walked in first, his expression tighter than it had been the day before, his movements less certain. Emily followed closely behind him, her composure still intact but no longer effortless. There was a sharpness in her eyes now, a calculation that had replaced the quiet confidence she once carried so easily. They both noticed me immediately, already seated, already waiting. That mattered. Richard cleared his throat slightly as he took his seat across from me, setting his hands on the table in a way that suggested he was trying to remain steady. "Margaret," he said, his voice controlled but lacking its usual certainty. I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement. "Richard." Emily sat beside him, smoothing her sleeve again, a small habit I had begun to recognize as a sign of tension rather than composure. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday," she said, her tone measured but firm. I met her gaze briefly, then shifted my attention back to the center of the table. "That is why we are here," I replied calmly. The attorney entered a moment later, followed by Thomas, who took a seat beside me without a word. The contrast was immediate. Two sides of the same table but not the same position. The other attorney began speaking first, his tone formal, outlining the purpose of the meeting, referencing the agreement that had been signed, the expectation of finalization. I listened without interruption, my posture unchanged, my expression neutral. When he finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that invites a response. I did not rush to fill it. Instead, I turned slightly toward Thomas, giving him a small nod. He opened his folder and placed a set of documents on the table, sliding them forward with deliberate care. Before any finalization, he said, his voice steady, precise, we need to address a number of material omissions and procedural concerns regarding the agreement signed yesterday. The word omissions landed exactly where it needed to. I watched as Richard's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tightening, his hands adjusting slightly on the table. Emily remained still, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the documents, then back to Thomas. There were no omissions, the other attorney responded quickly, his tone firm but edged with uncertainty. Thomas did not react to the interruption. He simply opened the first document and turned it so it faced them. On the contrary, he said, there are several areas where relevant information was not disclosed, including the current status of certain accounts and the nature of recent financial activities. He paused, allowing the words to settle, then continued. Additionally, there are concerns regarding the circumstances under which the agreement was presented and signed. I remained silent, my hands still resting lightly on the table, my gaze steady but not confrontational. This was not my moment to speak. This was the moment to let the structure reveal itself. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice more urgent now. What exactly are you implying? He asked. Thomas met his gaze evenly. I am not implying anything, he said. I am stating that the agreement is subject to review due to incomplete disclosure and potential bad faith actions. The room grew quieter, the tension no longer hidden beneath polite conversation. Emily finally spoke, her tone sharper than before. This is unnecessary, she said. Everything was agreed upon. I turned my head slowly and looked at her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that did not invite argument. Everything that was presented, I said evenly. Not everything that exists. She held my gaze, and for a brief moment, the confidence she had worn so carefully began to crack. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. Thomas placed another document on the table, this one marked more clearly, its contents more direct. As of yesterday afternoon, he continued, authorization protocols on several key accounts have been revised. Access is now restricted pending review. Richard's expression changed immediately, the realization settling in faster than he could mask it. You did what? He asked, his voice no longer steady. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I simply met his eyes and answered. I exercised my rights, I said. The simplicity of the statement left no room for argument. No room for interpretation. Just fact. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had been said before. Not because of volume but because of clarity. They had walked into the room expecting resolution. What they found instead was a structure they did not control. And as I sat there, calm, composed, completely certain, I understood something that neither of them had fully grasped until that moment. This was no longer about what they thought they could take. It was about what they had already lost. The silence in the room did not break immediately, and that was the point. It stretched, heavy and deliberate, settling over the table like something tangible. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes no longer avoiding mine but searching, as if he were trying to find the version of me he thought he understood. It was not there. Emily, on the other hand, did not lean back. She stayed forward, her posture controlled, her hands folded neatly in front of her. But there was a tension in the way her fingers pressed together that had not been there before. She was adjusting, recalculating. Thomas allowed the silence to hold for a moment longer before closing the folder in front of him with a soft, precise motion. Given the current circumstances, he said, we will be proceeding with a full review of all shared assets and agreements. Until that process is complete, no further transfers or decisions will be recognized without Mrs. Collins's authorization. The use of my name, formal and clear, shifted the dynamic again, not dramatically but enough. The other attorney opened his mouth to respond, then hesitated, as if measuring his words more carefully now. This is highly irregular, he said finally, though his tone lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. Thomas met his gaze evenly. It is entirely within the structure that was established, he replied. The provisions are clear. I watched as Richard exhaled slowly, his hand moving to his temple in a gesture I had seen many times before when something did not go according to his expectations. Margaret, he said, his voice softer now, almost measured in a different way. This does not have to become complicated. I turned my head slightly, meeting his eyes without urgency. It already is, I said. No emphasis. No emotion. Just acknowledgement. Emily shifted beside him, her composure tightening into something sharper. What exactly do you want? She asked, her voice controlled but no longer neutral. I considered the question for a brief moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood the weight of how it would be received. Then I spoke, my tone as steady as it had been from the beginning. Clarity, I said. Accuracy. And time. She held my gaze, searching again, but there was nothing to negotiate in what I had said. Richard leaned forward slightly, his expression more focused now, less certain but more intent. And after that? He asked. I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension, but because there was no need to rush the truth. After that, I said, we proceed based on what is actually there, not what was assumed. The distinction was simple, but it landed with weight. The other attorney shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at the documents on the table before speaking again. We will need time to review these claims, he said, choosing his words carefully. Thomas nodded once. Of course, he replied. That is the purpose of this process. There was no argument left to make in that moment, not without evidence, not without preparation. And for the first time since the meeting had begun, I could see it clearly in their posture. The certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more cautious. Emily straightened slightly, smoothing her sleeve again, but the gesture did not restore what had been there before. We will cooperate, she said, her tone controlled but edged with something else now. Something restrained. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without responding to it. Cooperation was no longer a matter of agreement. It was a necessity. The meeting did not end abruptly, but it shifted. What had begun as a finalization became a delay. What had been presented as settled became open. The structure had changed and with it the balance. I gathered my bag slowly, my movements unhurried, as the attorneys exchanged final remarks about timelines and documentation. Richard remained seated for a moment longer, watching me as if he were trying to understand how something so certain had unraveled so quickly. Emily stood beside him, her expression composed again but different now. More guarded, less assured. I did not wait for either of them to speak again. There was nothing left to say in that room. I walked to the door and opened it, pausing just long enough to allow the quiet behind me to settle into place. Then I stepped out into the hallway, the sound of the door closing soft but final. The building felt the same as it had when I arrived, but I moved through it differently now, not because anything had changed externally but because everything had been defined. When I reached the exit, I paused for a moment, looking out through the glass at the parking lot beyond. Cars moved. People passed. Life continued in its steady, indifferent rhythm. I stepped outside and walked toward my car, the air cool, the light sharp and clear. As I reached the driver's side door, I allowed myself a brief moment of stillness, my hand resting on the handle. Not to reflect. Not to question. Just to acknowledge. I had not raised my voice. I had not argued. I had not needed to. Because in the end, control does not come from being louder. It comes from understanding exactly when to act. And when to remain silent.